Sukuzani Emakhaya, and welcome to another exciting episode of The Inside Factor with me, your host Mudibe, Julius Mudibe. I'm joined here today by none other political activist, a political analyst, a former maths and science teacher, as well as an English teacher, Aubrey Matshiqi. Welcome to The Inside Factor. Now, let's get straight into it. How was it like growing up in Orlando?
Well, we need to get that right because there's Orlando East, which we called Orlando. So when people talk about Orlando, they are talking about Orlando East. I grew up in Orlando West, Pefeni, where the clevers come from. In fact, I grew up in a street called Sinsu. And our house, where I grew up, is 10 houses away from where Kaiser Mutawing grew up. In fact, when Kaiser 11, the precursor to Kaiser Chiefs, was formed, we had the privilege of seeing all these players going to the shops or doing their training in a small piece of ground just opposite Kaiser Mutawing's house. So when you talk about figures such as Banks Sitlodi, the goalkeeper, Ace Nsolengu, and others, these are not people we read about in newspapers. These are people we saw live every day, either training or going to the shops, going on with their normal lives. Pakstau is another person who grew up in that street. Twins, Mainline and Digi Khoza, who played for Chiefs also at some point, grew up in that street. Pitso Misimane's mother grew up on that street. So I grew up in an interesting street. And growing up there was not only interesting because my family did not convert to Kaiser Chiefs. When Kaiser Chiefs was formed, we stayed pirates. I can write a book, I can tell whole stories about the tensions that ensued because of my parents' refusal to convert to Kaiser Chiefs. But politically, that house, 8403 Sinsu Street, where I grew up, is the place where I got my first lesson in South African politics. What had happened is that my parents had asked a cousin of my mother's, who had gone to Botswana on business, to bring back an LP of Harry Belafonte and Miriam Makeba. Now, that LP at the time was banned. So when it finally did come, we could not play it during the day in case those who were spying on behalf of the special branch told the special branch that we were playing that LP. So we listened to that LP at night. And the songs and the people the songs were about were quite new to us as children because this was 1976. And it was before the 76 riots. So you have a song like Batleli Bonke in Tilongwe. Nanku Mandela, Nanku Sisulu, Nanku Sobuku. So as children, we were asking, who are these people? And as my parents explained each track to us, Kauleza, here are the police coming, and all of that. They were telling us stories not only of apartheid, they were also telling us stories of group areas, the Group Areas Act. They were telling us stories of Makhanda and how he had tried to escape from Robben Island. And so that was my first lesson in South African politics.
Now, as an Orlando Pirates supporter, I'm very happy to know that you didn't sell out and you continued being a Pagania.
Well, I always say to people, that Pirates, the club, if you don't support the Pirates, it looks flat.
Yeah. Now, many people do not know that you grew up and you joined, when we talk about your student activism, you were a member of Azaso. Can you walk us through your student activism days?
Well, actually, I was in COSAS first, the Congress of South African Students at high school. But before COSAS, I was fortunate that for some reason, the older students, when we got to high school, showed an interest in me. And each morning they would give me reading material that I would have to go when I got home in the afternoon, and I would read it at night. And in the morning I would sit with them, and we would have master classes with them teaching me about politics, South African history, African history, giving me books to read and all of that. So that was the next phase of my political development, with these older students showing an interest in my political development. And then later, while still in high school, I became a member of COSAS. And then when I got to tertiary, when I was doing my teacher training at the Soweto College of Education, I joined the Azanian Students Organization, Azaso. What was interesting about Azaso is the fact that, remember, you have a time when there is some tension between the Black consciousness movement adherents and those like us who were charterists. So in the UDF, people were puzzled by our refusal to change the name of Azaso, because they said, "Igama lama zimzim." You need to change it to reflect the fact that you are in the UDF, a front that was dominated mainly by those who aligned themselves to the Congress movement, the so-called charterists. And it is only after we had left tertiary institutions as students. In fact, I was already working when Azaso changed its name, not to SASCO. People forget that it first changed its name from Azaso to SANSCO, and then SANSCO to what we have today, which is SASCO. There was something very interesting about the student movement when we were in Azaso. There was a tension between the youth movement and the student movement. In fact, in Orlando West, from time to time, I had to go and intervene between the student movement and the youth movement, because sometimes the tensions threatened to become physical and violent. And on top of that, we had an interesting tension, as I said, interesting but deadly, because lives were lost, between the so-called Amazimzim, the adherents of Black consciousness, and the charterists, those who were aligned to the Congress movement. But when I look at my life as a student, as an activist, we used to say that there are four pillars of the struggle, or four pillars of the revolution. So I found myself as part of those forces that were engaging in mass mobilization against the apartheid state through the student movement, the union movement, civic movement, the youth movement, and so on. But I also found myself at some point being part of the political underground of the ANC, and later transitioned to become part of the military underground of the ANC as a member of Umkhonto weSizwe. And I might add that actually there are people who look at me today who are surprised, because what they remember is that young hothead, that young radical, And well, some people might say I'm still a hothead in some ways, but my head was much more hot than it is now. I think what I have not lost is my militancy. I am still militant. Now, I don't confuse militancy with madness. There was a time when I had to caution our comrades in the Youth League that they must be careful not to cross the line. There's a thin line between militancy and madness. And there were times when I thought some in the Youth League at some point were crossing that line between militancy and madness. So I am militant, but I don't think I'm mad. And that is why my posture is a radical posture when it comes to how this country should change. And that is why I come from the angle that to the extent that you can talk about a failed state in a non-academic sense, the post-apartheid state to me is a failed state. Because to me, a failed state is a state that betrays the aspirations of the people. So to me, the post-apartheid state is both a neo-apartheid state and a failed state, because it is failing the aspirations of our people.
Now, staying with student politics and student activism, recently we saw fees must fall activists coming out. We saw student protests coming out. And from someone who comes from the student movement background, when we wanted to preach this militancy, that we were often perceived as being violent and as being disruptive in a way. How important is it, especially for young people today, to be militant in the way they go about?
Well, there is an arrogance that I saw emerging amongst us who were activists in the student movement in the 80s. We tended to enter conversations with members of the Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall movement, as if all of us were the Dalai Lama. And as the Dalai Lama, we are there to teach this younger generation about what it means to be a student and how to engage in student activism. And what we forgot is that the times are different. The context is different. There are things we could do in the 80s, things that were possible because of the context then. And there are things which are possible today, which were not possible then, and vice versa. And I felt that in our interaction with the student movement of today, we came with this sense of arrogance. And arrogance that goes with a sense of nostalgia. Remember, when you look back, where you come from is always a golden period. And therefore we look at the student activism of the 80s as the golden period of student activism. And we are engaging with members of Fees Must Fall and the Roads Must Fall, who were not part of that golden period. And therefore in their conception of politics, in their conception of student activism, in their conception of what constitutes solutions to that which ails universities and other tertiary institutions, in their conception of what ails our society, we thought, coming from our golden period, we were better placed to dictate to them how they should prosecute the current phase of student struggles.
Now, as a person who grew up and was part of the military wing of the ANC, there's a video that often pops up on social media of Chris Hani, where he says that I did not personally agree when the leadership took a decision to ban the armed struggle. As a person who was part of that movement, when you first heard that decision, how did that make you feel?
Well, some of the roles I played in the military and political underground of the ANC included political education, for instance, propaganda, and I remember, first of all, that in 1986, the EDF published a paper in opposition to the negotiation process, not knowing that our leaders had already started negotiating with members of the apartheid regime. So comes 1990. In the political and military underground, one of my tasks was to explain to comrades why the ANC had made the right decision, firstly to negotiate, and secondly to suspend the armed struggle. And I was expressing a view that I did not agree with. I expressed that view and made it my task to convince the comrades, because that is what a disciplined cadre of the ANC does, especially a cadre in the position I was. Chris Hani himself is the one who has to go to the camps to explain the rationale behind the suspension of the armed struggle and the negotiation process as a whole. And at times had to articulate positions that he, as an individual, did not support. But as a disciplined cadre of the ANC, it was his task to do so. Now, today we invoke the same principle. We call on members of the ANC as disciplined cadres of the ANC to sometimes say things and act in a manner at variance with what they believe as individuals. The question I always ask is whether when we invoke that principle today, is the invocation of that principle still a revolutionary act, given the current state of a movement that is in a state of decline? A movement in many ways that is betraying our people. And therefore, it's quite possible that it can be argued today that there are circumstances when a member of the ANC who acts in accordance with the principle of acting against his own will, of acting against what he believes, because he is a disciplined member of the ANC, because this is what a disciplined member of the ANC does. There is an extent to which I think today that is counter-revolutionary. Because the ends to which this principle is invoked are not always revolutionary. So we do need a recalibration of this principle. Is it always revolutionary to act against your will because you are a disciplined cadre of the movement, when the movement is acting in a manner that is not revolutionary?
Now, you've mentioned how the movement is not acting in a revolutionary manner, and so many people have come out to say that the center is not holding in the ANC, if I could say so. There's two camps that people that have clearly drawn their lines. What do you think is happening now with this whole step-aside rule?
Well, firstly, there are multiple centers. The reason the center is not holding is that it has collapsed. And what has filled the vacuum are multiple centers. And some comrades, depending on what they need to achieve, on one issue will find themselves being part of one center, and on another will find themselves being part of another. In fact, because this forces them to belong to multiple centers, within the movement to achieve their narrow political and economic ends. There are times when your enemy is your friend and your friend is your enemy, depending on the issue. So that's the first thing about the collapse of the center. The second thing is this. Another thing which attends the collapse of the center is the fact that the ANC is not a strategic center anymore through which we can process revolutionary thought in pursuit of policies and programs for change that are aligned to the reason why we were in a struggle against colonialism and apartheid in the first place. And because the ANC is not a strategic center anymore, it is also not the leader of society anymore. And that is why, to some extent, you see this decoupling between the narrow and economic interests of those who lead this organization and many who are its members, on the one hand, and the interests of the people on the other.
Now, for young people who come to Matshiqi and say, now, what should we do now as black people now? What agenda should we now push? Which political party should we now look to? What would you say to them?
I would say you're asking the wrong person. And let me tell you why I would say that. We tend to think that the solution is to replace the ANC with another political organization, the DA, the EFF, or another political party. Because we have bought into this very conservative idea of democratic consolidation. Democratic theory, in my view, is conservative. Because democratic theory, particularly the element of democratic consolidation, is a theory that tells us that whatever change we desire must happen within the current political paradigm. In other words, as I keep on saying, we are like children who have a coloring book and millions of crayons of different colors. So within the outline of the picture, you can use as many colors as you want. The one thing you will not do is to change the outline of the picture. So my view is that fundamental change in the world and fundamental change in South Africa will happen the day we start changing the outlines of the picture. What that means for me is that we must question whether liberal democracy still serves us. I have, and my answer is that it doesn't. There's a chasm between what it promises and what it delivers. And the fact that it has attached itself to capitalism and its neoliberal logic at the moment, or that capitalism and its neoliberal logic have attached themselves to it, means that whatever change we dream of will remain just that, a dream. Because fundamental change will occur only if we accept that the way in which we do politics in the world and in our countries must change. In other words, politics is no longer the solution. Either we need to reconceptualize politics, or we need something else in the place of politics. In my own view, given who I am convinced in terms of what I have seen that the political must become subordinate to the spiritual. I'm not saying to the religious, to the spiritual. So to the extent that we have a crisis in the ANC, we make the mistake of thinking it's a crisis limited to the ANC. And to solve it, you must replace the ANC with or by another party. When in essence, what needs to happen is for us to understand that what we have is a generalized political crisis. And all the political parties in our system are emblematic of that crisis. And therefore, the political system itself is emblematic of that system. So if you want fundamental change, the political system must go and be replaced by a political system that will deliver the kind of radical and fundamental change we've been talking about.
Now, we've touched on the ANC, and I want to touch on the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance. Recently, we saw how one of their leaders got removed from the party because of fake qualifications. And then on social media, there was uproar about what Natasha Mazon, who also faked her qualifications, but then she remained in the party. Now, you find an instance where black people even today are still surprised to say, why is this one staying, why is this one going? Do you think that black people should stop even questioning such things because the party has taken a clear direction with regards to its policies?
I have become very impatient with our political discourse. Sisinisa mahleza. We engaged in conversations dominated, frankly, by nonsense. We spent days and weeks discussing that this leader of the DA and that leader of the DA do not have a tertiary qualification. When we should be talking about something much more fundamental, the position of the Democratic Alliance in our politics and in our society. This is a party that exists to promote the narrow interests of a white, English-speaking middle class. That is the primary reason this party exists. It doesn't matter how many millions of black people join it as members and how many of them become part of its leadership. The underlying logic is a logic that seeks to achieve that goal, the goal of promoting the narrow interests of a white English-speaking middle class. If you go a bit broader than that, it's a party that exists to promote the interests of whiteness. And here I'm not talking about skin color. I'm talking about whiteness as a way of seeing, as a way of knowing, as a way of being, as a worldview, the dominant reality in South Africa. Is that the party you want to see one day the ruling party of South Africa? For me, that's the question. We have other pseudo discourses, which to me amount to nothing more than misdirection, like the discourse of corruption. I still maintain, and I say this because unless I say it, my next argument is not going to be palatable. So I will say it. By the time Jacob Zuma leaves office, corruption in South Africa is no longer endemic. It has become systemic. That is the dominant culture in both the private sector and the public sector. But corruption is not the main challenge facing South Africa. The main challenge facing South Africa is inequality. So we buy into this narrative, dominant narrative, of focusing narrowly on corruption. Because when you do so, the finger is pointing away from those who are responsible for the neo-apartheid our people still have to live through today. So if we focused on inequality, the finger would be pointing in the direction of those who benefited from colonial apartheid. If you talk corruption, you achieve two things. You give corruption a black face, but more importantly, you erase the sin of apartheid. And that is why I've become quite impatient even to participate in these discussions, because they are, to me, nothing more than misdirection. They misdirect us from the conversations we should be having if we want fundamental change in this country.
Now, talking about whiteness and about culture, for someone who grew up in white schools, who grew up idolizing whiteness, if I could say so, our culture and traditions were often called barbaric. You could not even speak your own African language at school. And I just want to understand, because the fundamental role and the fundamental problem that I saw was media, if I could say so, because every day on TV, all we see is whiteness. We want to portray whiteness. We want to live according to the norms and standards of whiteness. To what role would you say has media contributed in pushing the anti-black agenda?
Well, I will repeat one or two things I've been saying for years. And I will stop saying them the day I have no reason to repeat them. Let's talk about Western modernity. The darker side of Western modernity is coloniality. And coloniality gives us colonialism. What is behind the logic of coloniality is the idea that those who are not European and white are ontologically inferior, are not human, or at least are not as human as those who are European and white. Secondly, they are epistemologically inferior. They lack the capacity to produce knowledge and to engage with knowledge, precisely because they are not human, precisely because they are ontologically inferior. The white colonizer comes with a religion called Christianity here. And here, let me hasten to add, the problem is not Christianity, the problem is the Christian. And misappropriates, amongst other things, the 10 Commandments. And says, thou shalt have no other God but me. In other words, thou shalt have no other God but the God of my Bible. Because your God is either not God, not even a God, to the extent that he is God, he's not a true God, unlike my God, the God of my Bible. But more importantly, I am, as a white man, God's representative on earth. Therefore, I am your God. When you engage in anti-colonial struggles, you engage in a struggle against me, who is God. You engage in a struggle against God. So part of the damage that has occurred to us comes from this logic I've just articulated. But colonialism and apartheid does something else. You have a numerical minority that oppresses the numerical majority that it found in this country. But that numerical minority has become the cultural majority, whose worldview, whose ways of knowing, whose ways of seeing, whose ways of being have become dominant. And one of the reasons they have become dominant is because, as I said, whiteness is not just skin color. As I said, it's a way of seeing, way of knowing, way of being, a worldview that has become part of our own reality as black people, particularly those who are educated and Christian. In fact, the most assimilated amongst us are those who are educated. And we take pride in how adept we have become in the grammar of whiteness. So you must also remember that the media becomes part of this dynamic, but also is part of another dynamic. Remember that for capitalism to thrive, capitalism must become a god that is able to create like a god. So capitalism must produce, as Dr. Lwazulu Shaba says, must produce men and women with certain appetites. And those appetites advance the interests of capital and capitalism itself. And therefore, for capitalism to thrive, and for this dominant reality of whiteness to thrive too, a reproductive element must be introduced to society. There are certain relations, gender, class, race, culture, and so on, that must be reproduced as part of the process of creating this man and woman with particular appetites. A man who mimics the grammar of whiteness. A man who becomes uncritical of the grammar of whiteness. And one of the tools you use to reproduce this reality is the education system. Another is popular culture. Another is the media.
Now, staying with education, very interesting that you picked that up. I want to go into our curriculum, and people have come out to say that we are not taught about people like Robert Sobukwe, we're not taught about people like Credo Muto, we're not taught about blackness in our school education. What do you think, how should our government, and as a black government, because one of the things we struggle with is because when you look at our government, it's a black government, if you could say so, but the curriculum speaks something different. Now, how do you think that our government should handle this issue of giving black children an education system which teaches them about themselves?
Well, again, skin color is not the issue. The issue is what we, those who are black and occupy leadership positions, and I'm using the word leadership loosely. The issue is, what is it that we have internalized? Because remember, racism is not or completely a dynamic that is external to the black body, the black mind, the black heart, the black soul. To some extent, it has become a dynamic that is internal also to the black body. And to that extent, the color of your skin is irrelevant. Because what is important is what you have internalized and how it makes you relate with the world. And the relations I've spoken about, class, gender, race, and so on. Another thing we must remember is that what does the colonizer colonize? The colonizer colonizes the mind. Hence, Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes about decolonizing the mind. But decolonizing the mind is incomplete because it is not only the mind that was colonized. The colonizer colonizes the body. And interestingly, if your black body is that of a black man, the colonizer, to some extent, uses your black body as a black man to colonize the body of a black woman. The colonizer colonizes our spirit, our essence. The colonizer colonizes our relationship with time, our relationship with space. Look at the damage that has been caused through the colonization of time, through our use of the Gregorian calendar. A conception of time that removes us from our relationship with nature. Our conception of time was linked to the cycles and motion and movement of nature. The Gregorian calendar has destroyed that. And that's why I say the colonizer colonizes time and our relationship with time. It colonizes our relationship with space. You can commodify space, you can commodify land to be something you can sell or buy. Not as something that connects you to something much higher. And therefore, an education system you need is an education system that sensitizes us to the need for harmony. And what do I mean by harmony? Harmony in your relationship with the divine. Whatever the divine is to you, can be God, can be the source, or whatever it is. Harmony in your relationship with our ancestors. Harmony in your relationship with the universe and what lies beyond the universe. Harmony in your relationship with nature. Harmony in your relationship with others, because such harmony would never make you do what the colonizer does to the colonized. But all these forms of harmony are contingent on something more important: harmony within. You need an education system that sensitizes us to that. For me, that would be the pinnacle of the decolonial project. But the decolonial project is not the end, it's the means towards another end, in this way. In fact, there is no end. For two reasons. That you need an education system and you need education. So I'm using the two as two different things. You need an education system and you need education. That reignites the light within. And what is that light within? The light within is freedom. Including freedom from the known. If there's one thing our education system must teach us, it's freedom from the known. But obviously, you can't be free from the known unless you know what the known is. So once you learn something and it becomes knowledge, you then have to learn the fact that knowledge is always in the past. Hence the need to free yourself from the known. But once you have succeeded and you learn something new, the journey to begin freeing yourself from that known begins. And therefore this is an eternal thing, it never stops. But it also means we may have to accept that sometimes we have a situation where freedom from the known coexist side by side. Which means, once you achieve a point where you are free from the known, you must begin the process of freeing yourself from that freedom itself. And the question is, what lies beyond that freedom? And this is one of the questions our education system must help us to answer.
Now, I was having a interesting conversation with a friend of mine, and we're talking about leadership. And you mentioned leadership right now, so you might be using the term loosely. Do you think that we take chances with who we elect into positions of power, looking at how people can just buy delegates at conferences and be elected as president? Do you think as African people we take chances with something as important as leadership?
Why do we call them positions of power? Because in our own context, we have a party called the African National Congress that is in government, but is it in power? Again, I will repeat what I'm about to say until I have no reason to repeat it. South Africa belongs not to all who live in it. South Africa belongs to those who conquered it. That is still the dominant reality in our country. And therefore, what do we mean when we say the ANC is in power? It is in government, but is it in power? And that is why I argued recently in another interview that members of the ANC talk about how the struggle against apartheid was a struggle about the transfer of power from the apartheid state to the people. And that power would be exercised through an organization of the people, such as the ANC. To what extent was the 1994 democratic breakthrough about the transfer of power, actual power? To what extent was it about the illusion of the transfer of power? To what extent was it about the transfer of that which is illusory? These are questions we must ask ourselves. To be in leadership, amongst other things, is to ask these questions. To be in leadership, amongst other things, is to change the reality of those who are oppressed during colonialism and apartheid so that they no longer have to ask these questions because they are truly in power. Is that the case today? You still need to persuade me that is the case. And therefore, you still need to persuade me that these people who occupy positions are leaders.
Now, looking at the political dynamics today, where do you think we are as a country? And when me and you were outside, we mentioned how ilizwe alphilanga. What does that mean?
Well, let me quickly answer a question you asked about step aside. There would be no need for the ANC to pass resolutions on stepping aside when its members have brought the party into disrepute if revolutionary discipline was in place. The ANC is here today being torn apart by this step-aside debacle because of a failure in a revolutionary discipline. Secondly, there is no one in the ANC who can impose his or her moral authority on the rest of the party. There is no faction, there is no group in the ANC that has the moral authority to impose its will on the rest of the party. That is another problem. That is the state of the ANC. Because the ANC has become so dominant, it has infected us with this malaise. But as I said, if you look at the numbers from 2009 until now, you look at electoral support for the ANC, it's very clear. Our people have started the process of decoupling their interests from the interests of the ANC. Now, that one day the ANC will not be the ruling party of this country, and that is inevitable, by the way, it will happen. That the ANC is not going to be the ruling party of this country forever does not mean, in qualitative terms, the order, political, economic, and social order that will follow will be better. Can be worse. it can be worse because, as I said, removing the ANC and replacing it with another political party does not complete our historic mission. Our historic mission is fundamental change. And for me, what it has come to mean is that we must uproot the liberal democratic aesthetic and the extent to which it manifests in our politics, and the extent to which it is the dominant logic in our political system, and therefore we must uproot the political system. If in qualitative terms you want a social, political, and economic order that is the antithesis of what we have today.
Now, my final question to you, what is your dream for South Africa?
My dream for South Africa is this. So I look at the fire at Charlotte Matshiqi, the fires in Cape Town, the African Studies building burns down, the Rose Memorial burns down. There was another fire in KZN. These are not just fires. These fires are prophecies of a storm of fire that is coming to this country if we do not change. The same applies to COVID-19. It is not only a virus. It is a messenger. It is an opportunity. And therefore the fires themselves, if we look at them in terms of the prophetic, are an opportunity for us to pause, reflect, meditate about the human condition and how to make it better. And how in that process we can reach for our higher selves and do better and be better. So mine is not a very ambitious dream. I'm asking for something very simple. We must sit and reflect on the meanings of the signs of the times. Because the signs of the times are an opportunity for us to reach for our higher selves, to be better and do better about the human condition. That's my dream.
Gogo, Bugega Kul.
Thomas.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was another exciting episode of The Inside Factor. Please watch our interviews every Sunday at 6 p.m. on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter at The Inside Factor. You can follow me on Twitter at mmudiba10. Follow my co-host at Tabamakwakwa. You can also drop us a message on our WhatsApp line that's on 081 348 6914. Until next time, goodbye.